The future well-being of one's children is arguably the most important thing a parent can focus on. In addition to choosing a good mate, encouraging strong peer groups while your child is maturing have been shown as the two most important factors in helping them develop successfully. Beyond that, education is arguably an important aspect of a child's maturation, but little evidence exists that public school is a required, let alone preferable, alternative to private school or other approaches. Today, our guest, Lynn Lockhart, mother of several young children, shares with us a brief history of the public education system in the United States and her strategies for giving her children the best homeschooling education and chance in life that she has crafted to date.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
The military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time theater. На полный разгром гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. I'm Hank Oslo, and I'm joined here by a very special guest, Lynn Lockhart. Say hello, Lynn.
Hello, everyone.
And also joined by a full house today. We've got Adam Smith.
Hey.
Hans Lander.
Hello.
And Nick Mason.
Good evening.
And today we're going to be talking about the U.S., kind of a broad look at the U.S. primary education system, sort of focusing on homeschooling, particularly as it's kind of developed in the latter half of the 20th century, which is something that, we're all very well acquainted with just by virtue of having gone through that system in one form or another. I know we have kind of widely divergent experiences on the show, but before we get into that, maybe we can go kind of hit the rewind button and look at kind of the state of the world in the first half of the 20th century, kind of as things were starting to be very professionalized and proceduralized and industrialized in the U.S. education sector. I think, Lynn, you had some stuff on that.
Thank you, Hank. The turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century marks what is the end of what's known as the common school era and the beginning of the public school era. During the common school era, there were some state schools, but it was quite localized, and the attendance was still limited to people who were explicitly interested in their own education. So beginning in 1900, it really became compulsory for every single child to be in school, and you started to see the length of the school day lengthen and the number of school days per year increase, and the ages of the children, also the age range, would increase. Younger children and older children both were starting to be required to go to school. So in the first part of the 20th century, that's really just starting to get consolidation. You start to get the Department of Education, which was first called, I think it was the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And only in 1980 did it become the Department of Education. But actually, the preceding agency was formed in 1953, so it fits more in with the second half. But there were federal offices going back to the 19th century. So what you see is just a parallel of many other processes that were taking place at the same time, which is the consolidation of federal power, consolidation of the culture, and a movement towards homogenization, really.
Yeah, I think it's interesting if you look at it through the lens of what's happening with the broader American population, because this was when mechanization was really clearing out the countryside. You had vast flights of people into the cities, particularly around the two world wars, and the kind of consequent hollowing out of the rural population. It wasn't really, the Depression certainly also had a effect, but one of the primary reasons as a rural family that you have a lot of kids is because they're your farm help. And if you're stuck out in the middle of nowhere, effectively, it's actually very difficult to get them into kind of one of these huge centralized high schools. So it tended to be very, very decentralized, maybe even effectively homeschooled, but the kind of stereotypical one-room schoolhouse. But by according to my notes, by 1959, you had gone from 20 years earlier, there had been 117,000 independent school districts, and that shrank by a factor of about 3 to 41,000. That trend has continued until the present day. So there's a vast kind of centralization of authority that went on.
Yeah, so who would be the teachers in these in the older one-room school format?
Well, have you ever seen Little House on the Prairie? I mean, it was often just like one of the local mothers who wanted to instill education.
Is that true though? Because I have read in the past that it was men. It was actually largely men who would be the teachers.
I think men also, and sometimes they were kind of itinerant guys that would just show up in town and say, "Hey, I'll teach," and the kids would show up or not show up.
In antiquity, it would be slaves.
That's right.
Does anyone know when the education or the schooling was happening? Because as Hank points out, my understanding is that a lot of the children were put to work pretty early on. And so was it a seasonal thing? Was it like an age-based thing? That's
both. Yeah, both. It started as it would just expand. So each step along the way that the children would get younger and older, the compulsory schooling and the number of days, and everything would just increase and increase. And I think the Prairie House books are a great reference, a great source for what frontier life could have been like. And you have to be careful because it's fictional, but they were written contemporaneously. And in those books, if the kid wants to stay home and help dad do whatever chore he's doing, then he stays. It was really casual. They didn't have a way of enforcing attendance or truancy.
Right. There is an interesting episode, and I can't speak for the books. I know the television show is based on the books, but the television show, at least, I saw some of it. And there was one episode where the mother of the family, who's also the school teacher of the town, she tries to recruit basically one of the children whose father will basically insist that he's wasting his time at the schoolhouse. It's sort of ironic that this is 100 plus years ago, but it's maybe he was ahead of his time in some ways, or maybe he wasn't. But the sort of basic lesson was that he needs to get this education in order for him to advance in the world. And that's been the argument for my whole life, at least. And I think only until recently it's becoming under a lot of scrutiny. But that was that was a more common attitude from what I'm getting from that episode back then.
It jumps ahead a little bit, but you'll find more often than not that the arguments for the government school system as opposed to for private or homeschooling, they very, very rarely refer to the notion of kind of advancing yourself. It's mostly an appeal to petty authority and socialization.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I always mix up Laura Ingalls and Laura Ingalls Wilder. Laura Ingalls being the female aviator and Hitlerist. Laura Ingalls Wilder being
the actress.
No, she's
The writer.
the author.
Oh,
of
right.
Homeschooling Prairie.
All right. Okay.
Small difference, but important.
You also had like the emergence of a lot of compulsory education laws coupled with, fully government funded, at least primary schools. I think most of the truancy and mandatory attendance laws date to about the 1930s or so. And you do see this weird thing with the Depression too, where when the economy sucks, and you see this even with the Great Recession, when the economy sucks and there's not a lot of jobs to go around, people are a lot more comfortable staying in school or having their kids stay in school because it's like, well, you're in the schoolhouse or you're just kind of hanging out. So you might as well try to educate yourself to some degree.
One of the things I think you mentioned, Hank, was the number of school districts, the number of independent schools declining once the 20th century happened.
Yeah, the number of independent school districts. So most states kind of the school systems have this still existing tradition of fairly strong local control where it usually doesn't follow any sort of other political boundary in most of the country. In some areas it does, but you have these weird, very gerrymandered independent school districts that are, formed for a variety of purposes to preserve property values or keep out the blacks or, what have you.
Well,
one of the
things that I've noticed in the early 20th century in particular was a lot of municipal consolidation. There was a huge amount of incorporation for, kind of loose municipalities going on, particularly in California and throughout other Western states into the early 20th century. And I'm wondering if that is part of the reason why you saw a number of schools sort of consolidating as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's the general trend towards when you're trying to develop a large economic base,
right?
The local elite ends up driving the show, as is sort of inevitable, and they seek to kind of have control over the entire process that they're trying to drive. So essentially, if you have something that's very scattered, like Los Angeles, that has God only knows how many cities, but ended up having a lot of the development being driven kind of by the broader ecosystem through like state level financing of projects, county level financing of projects. Like they want to be able to develop that entire region. And I think, the schools, as much as they talk about this as a meme, I don't think that anyone really seriously thinks that there's kind of a direct linkage between things like how much economies of scale you have in your elementary school and your the health of your local economy or businesses or what have you. But I think it's part of the same process of political consolidation, where if you have one county, one municipality, it's going to be very difficult for you to maintain 30 different little school districts within that.
I agree with that. I think that the simple bureaucratic process of increasing your own fiefdom is at work greatly in the entire history of public schooling.
Well, in our progressive era episode, I tried to make the point that the progressive era really had its roots in the very beginning of the United States as a independent country. The bureaucracy of America began sometime in the 1820s, really, not in 1920s, as I think a lot of mainstream conservatives like to conceive of it. In the National Bureau of Economic Research, they have this really cool little white paper. It's only 14 pages on the history of federal grants to states. And they note that another set of grants beginning in 1816 provided that states be given 5% of the net proceeds of land sales within their boundaries with the stipulation that 3% should be used for the encouragement of learning, of which 1/6 part shall be exclusively bestowed on a college or university. In 1862, by the first Morrill Act, Congress gave both land and money to establish colleges in every state, not, as earlier, only in the states in which federal lands were situated. These early grants indicated that the federal government was prepared to assist state and local performance of a function, education, in which a national interest existed. Grants were outright donations. There was no matching requirement, and the government did not reserve the right to supervise the expenditure. But now I think with Title IX and a lot of elements of the Department of Education, the federal government demands not only spending requirements, but that the schools restructure all kinds of their daily activities in a way that the Department of Education would like.
And it's not even like the empirical structuring a lot of the time. It's this metaphysical notion of compliance, which ends up in practice being a lot of make work for a lot of different administrators and office staff at every level from the school to the district. You've got to have certification that you're complying with all of these requirements, and the actual concrete change in whatever you're teaching can be whatever, but the concrete output of that is your compliance report, which of course somebody with a college degree has to sit down and write. So like much of federal policy, it ends up being a cat lady full employment program.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of education parameters were, as with a lot before 20th century America, there was a sort of soft enforcement. You belonged to a professional association, and that was sort of the cultural enforcement for what you would want to do. And in 1857, that's when the National Education Association was started. And it's started really as a just professional network for sort of sharing knowledge, letters, and so on between public educators. But in 1857, that's a relatively small group of people. Now it's the largest, basically, labor union in the country. Originally it was just this sort of professional association to join on a whim.
You mentioned, Hans, the progressive episode we did, and I believe I mentioned a certain individual when we did that episode who had a lot to do with the standardization of education in the United States, and that would be Horace Mann.
Yeah.
Lynn, would you like to talk about Horace Mann for a little bit?
I can tell you a little bit about Horace Mann, and this is really what I was getting at with my comment, is that from what I read about him, he was first and foremost an extremely efficient bureaucrat. And he went around trying to standardize schools, visiting every single school in Massachusetts, I think, and collecting reports and writing reports. And this is what he came up with, and he was really the pioneer of public schooling in America. And that was the common school era. And I think it's important to note that he was what we would think of as just a blue blood WASP of Massachusetts, and that the New England states were ground zero for public schooling, and that it followed this kind of progression from social engineering to create good citizens with Christian morals, not Catholic morals, right? Protestant morals, and not necessarily to educate, but really to create the young generation of well-behaved citizens.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to ask, what exactly are his metrics for success? And I guess you're sort of implying that it's behavioral rather than intellectual or academic, it seems. But we've lived through, in our lifetimes at least, probably 2, 3 national level initiatives to try to come up with some kind of metric system for understanding.
Novel.
Yeah, there's Common Core, No Left,
right.
No Child Left Behind, all these weird.
There have been about a dozen of those.
Right.
Yeah. It's like no one can remember what happened before, and we have to try all kinds of things again and again. And I would be happy to talk about reading in that context and math as well. But
well, we
you know,
can definitely do that when we get to the more modern era. I was just
Right.
curious in that sort of concept. Did Horace Mann attempt to kind of measure the different schools that he was visiting in terms of their achievements, or what was really his standardization drive all about? Or was it just basically like, you know, this school is against what I think is good, and then therefore that school needs to be reformed? Or he's looking for in business, they do this concept called best practices. They'll oftentimes, you know, do factory tours of competitors, and they'll sort of let each other into each other's, sort of open the kimono, so to speak, and try to learn from each other. I have a feeling he wasn't doing that, but
God, I love that expression.
Yeah.
Open kimono.
Yeah,
I think he was looking for things like hygiene and attendance and behavior in the classroom. Things
that he thought were important, it seems like.
Well, and things that
not
were
just
important.
him, things that his class believed were important.
Exactly,
To
right.
inculcate into the youth the civic religion.
That's right. That's what it is. And I think perhaps in that time, the reading and writing and so forth were more taken for granted, versus now we have 2 centuries worth of innovations and how people should learn how to do these things. But it wasn't the primary purpose of it. The primary purpose was sort of a civic purpose to standardize the children, the people themselves.
Well, he was, I think he was a Whig, right? He was part of the Whig movement right before
Yes.
their
Yep.
collapse in the late 1850s. Yeah. One of the things that people often forget is that a lot of modern public education, especially in the very early 20th century, was the result of billionaires establishing this sort of education system that they knew that the average room and all these immigrants coming in from Italy and Eastern Europe, well, we can't really put them in the private schools our kids go to, but we need to have them have good manners and do basic things, build
Hygiene.
products. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was part
And
of
this is why it's parallel, right? Because this is why it gained speed in the early 20th century, because you
Right.
had this big influx of immigrants. And I found in the Gatto book, the what is it? The Underground History of American Education. He notes that in 1906, immigrant public schools in Manhattan began performing tonsillectomies and adenoidectomies in school without notifying parents. And yeah, it was the Italians and others that went nuts, and he said,
Well,
you can't do this.
Biopower.
In our immigration episode, I think one statistic I noted was that Austro-Hungarian immigrant children had a 37% chance of not knowing how to read. I mean, they couldn't necessarily even read or write in Hungarian or in Austrian German or any language part of the empire. They just had no literacy skills whatsoever. So
Right.
the American education system, and you have a lot of billionaires like Guggenheim and Rockefeller in particular, who are looking at these cities being swamped with not only sort of country bumpkins from the South and parts of the prairie, but everyone from Eastern Europe appears to be pouring into Manhattan. So they undertake this idea of, well, if we build a general education system for them all that can be found anywhere in the country, no matter where that they go or move to, we can achieve some kind of social harmonization, and in the process we can teach them to be factory workers. That was a general idea. I think that you guys can probably get into the Prussian background, but in 1903, Rockefeller set up the General Education Board, and it was basically this trend that we know now very well with NGOs sort of promoting certain goods or services. Well, this is an NGO promoting basic public schooling, which was not a given. Interestingly enough, at the turn of the 20th century, there wasn't a given that you were going to be educated. You might learn how to repair something or farm, but there's no guarantee that you would go to school.
And it remains a rite of passage for billionaires today, right?
Right.
That
Yeah.
you have to fork over some amount of money to be burned up by public schools.
Well, Education Realist, that's a great blog. I think everyone should
I
read.
endorse that blog.
He's had several, I believe it's a he. He's had several posts on charter schools, and something we can also get into. But one of the things he notices is that the new rite of passage appears to be billionaires donating to charter schools in New York City. That's basically like the new wave, now that the public education system is just an established part of American life and is increasingly like the center of a lot of American life in most places. The new idea is to contribute to these specialized charter schools that are there to look after the token black kids that are into robotics or whatever.
Right. I think he hates charter schools because they funnel off the best kids from the public schools, and then they also reduce funding for public schools in the same process.
Why don't you talk a little bit, Lynn, about John Taylor Gatto and his general thesis about education?
Yeah, John Taylor Gatto has written, I think, a few different books about, at least the underground history of American education is available for free, and I'm sure you'll put up a link, Adam, when we get there. But he was a public school teacher, and he just became disgusted with the work and started to learn about the history of public schooling and advocate for alternatives. And it's very interesting because he traces this Moldbugian type of progression from WASP to secular humanist human people factory activity, that public schools are meant to create these compliant and docile people, and they don't concern themselves with education. He's a little bit, for my taste, he's a little bit, has that progressive disease himself, because he kind of believes that every child is meant to be a curious wonder of life and capable of.
Yes, Lynn, I'm very glad you said that, because I encountered John Taylor Gatto's work many years ago while he was still alive, and that was exactly my impression. He has a lot of very useful insights into just as a positive history, but his normative conclusions tend to be deeply egalitarian. And yes, the assumption is that every child a star, and that every child is capable of becoming, Ezra Pound or something.
Right.
And that's just the fact. What he seems to ignore, and this is when he starts talking about Prussian style education and standardization and conformity to the state as if it's a bad thing. It is a bad thing in the American context, because what it is conformity to a mercantile empire.
Economic God.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas conformity to a true military style state, to a true Prussian style state, this is good. And you can still have the people who are outliers, who are meant to do other tasks than be warriors. You can have them be educated on higher levels, and you can also find people who come from the bottom of economic conditions and who have natural gifts for intellect and creativity, and you can pluck them out and put them into a higher track and a higher education. But a problem I have with Prussian style system in the United States is just the nature of the United States, of the ruling elite, and of the zeitgeist of America.
Right.
Conformity to that is about making people nothing but economic cogs.
Well, he makes an analogy during one of his interviews, I think it was on Red Ice, that school systems are actually very much akin to how factories used to work, at least when that system was set up in the United States. It was literally like the bells would ring, for recess, like the factory bells.
Well, yeah, and that's why Rockefeller was financing.
It was intentional,
Which is just demonstrably the worst possible way for somebody to actually get into a flow state where they're understanding or accomplishing something. It's completely the opposite. It's classical conditioning towards distractedness.
Operant conditioning.
Yeah.
Right. So where I might defend John Taylor Gatto's opinion is that if you have a holistic approach to life, or a religious approach, then you can take everybody at their own potential, and find a place for them in your community. So, and what he ignores is that in the earlier era, the common school era and earlier, that people were attending high school because they had shown aptitude for studies, or because their families insisted on it. And even what we know about things like the Ivy Leagues is that it was never this meant to be this intense intellectual experience. It's meant to be an experience with your social peers, where you kind of consolidate your social group and go on to rule the nation as God intended, right? For those for that class of people. So if you have this selection mechanism in place, then yes, everyone is going to do well. And then if you destroy that selection mechanism, then all of a sudden your average scores will look really bad. And what we know that is still true in the American schooling system, because everybody loves to hate it, is that lots of children and lots of people learn a lot and are really smart and do well. You have to disaggregate the data. So I think there are kids and people who just are going to do well, even if you use bad pedagogical techniques, or you can ruin these kids, but it does a huge disservice to the average and below average kids who are just forced to be in this environment and also ruin the environment for everyone else.
Yeah, I mean, one of the takeaways from a lot of the unschooling research is actually, I think the original place that I saw this was Brian Kaplan, who is an aggravating man, but writes okay on actually his three books are actually pretty good.
Ironically, I think Education Realist has been putting out a series case against education.
Yeah, I mean, I have mixed feelings about both of those. I think it's a little bit more subtle, but I mean, if you look at comparisons between people who just didn't have any schooling or who dropped out and came back, once you control for IQ and socioeconomic status and everything else, it appears that education just has effectively zero effect on anything. It's like you might as well just literally drop them in a room, and just go play.
Well, the term is warehousing. I mean, that's literally what a lot of people who are typically brighter and more self-aware would describe their educational experience as, where they were just wasting away at a desk.
Right. But to go back to the Prussian question, it's a huge difference when you have the king just saying, hey, I want my subjects to be educated, versus you have the way in the United States was implemented across the entire population sort of indiscriminately, and then you tried to beat everyone into this factory mold. So it's a big difference. So going back to what Nick said, I can see where you're coming from, that it's completely different. It's based on the Prussian system, but grows into something completely different.
Well, the objectives are clearly different. I mean,
well, the nature of the state is different. It's the basic principle that is being derived from the Prussian education system is to engender conformity to the state and to give a bare minimum of education so people are on the same level and can be useful in service to the state.
In particular, a military state. What I was going to say was that the American system, I think prior to the 1960s, was a little bit like that, but also much more commercial. Today, however, I would say it is conformity to the quote-unquote state, but it's almost like the globalist state, I would argue. And I think
absolutely.
How can you serve the revolution?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, James had written that when he went to his grandson's school, who I think he was in first or second grade, they have this mission statement up on the wall, and it says something like, let's see, I have it written. We are responsible for reaching our fullest potential so that we are prepared to contribute to our global society in the 21st century.
Oh my God.
At an elementary school.
Was that like Written by the Rockefeller Foundation or something.
Oh, it was on the wall of their school.
So when I was a kid,
the
the song in kindergarten was "This land is your land, this land is my land," from California to the New York Islands. Well, now it's going to be from California to California because it goes in a loop. It's a 360.
But it's absolutely for globalization, and I wanted to talk about too because I was talking about James LaFond. For listeners who don't know, James has appeared on the Myth of the 20th Century several times, and he has a book that is awaiting editing by me because I'm slow, called "Why Grown-Ups Suck," and he talks about his grandson's school and other other things. But I believe it's very cruel to treat small children this way. And I remember when I went mostly to just really pretty decent public schools. And I'm around 40. So when I was young, it was that we have to save the whales, and the rainforests are being destroyed, and the hole in the ozone layer, things that a 7 or 8 or 9-year-old has absolutely no business worrying about or knowing about or understanding. And now you have these kids who are being told that they're going to contribute to global society in the 21st century.
I can tell you, actually, when I was in the early phases of elementary school, I had a teacher that was super environmentalist, which I'm not against, but to the degree that which she was at, she had us doing field trips to like pull weeds, infectious weeds, whatever the term is, foreign weeds. My father was like, why is she wasting your time on this? And this is basically slave labor. And then I was actually so caught up in this stuff that I would come home crying, and my mother would start get worried about me because she was like, what's wrong? And I'm like, there's pollution. There's pollution. Right. I can't go to sleep. There's pollution. And so it is traumatic to teach these kids this type of stuff. I mean, I was pretty serious. I still am, but it's like I took it seriously, took it to heart. I'm like, what can I do? What the hell can a 6-year-old do? Nothing. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous.
Another friend has a story for me, which is that his son, who goes to school in Portland, the teacher, and this is again a grade school, the teacher is a Trump hater and telling the children that you're not safe in Trump's America. And, whatever you think of the guy, to kind of torture the kids like that, make them feel unsafe. And also, all the children were expected to agree with this assessment. And this boy knew that he should, regardless of what the family opinions were. So he went along with it and said, yeah, Trump's a bad guy, whatever. So, but it's just this type of instinct, I think.
The teacher class is made up of predominantly sadists and perverts.
And it's true. It's absolutely true. And the lowest of the low in terms of IQ for college graduates.
Exactly, yeah.
I believe that the rate of child molestation is actually higher in public schools than any sort of Catholic diocese.
Yes.
I mean, despite all of the attention or the last 40 years paid to sexual improprieties in Catholic dioceses, it does not come close to the numerous scandals about or regarding public school teachers, particularly at the elementary school level.
I had a teacher in high school who is currently in prison.
And let me say this: the shocking rise in the number of 20-something teachers fresh out of getting their education masters having sex with 14-year-old boys. I don't know about any of you, but that seems to me like a more pressing issue that no one really wants to diagnose as a bigger trend.
I don't know. That's the running joke about, well, it's a tragedy if a man does it to a little girl, but If
but
a
the fact
woman
that
does
it
it to
exists,
a little
The
girl,
It's
fact
the
that it
lawlessness.
exists is
it's
insane.
bizarre, and it says
Yeah.
something about the underlying mental health of that population.
Oh, I
When,
agree.
That's
when
right.
like
That's right.
that
Yeah.
much of your bell curve is
right.
deciding that they're going to
Well,
bang
and
14-year-olds.
You're right, and it says something about the sort of sect of people or demographic of people that will become public school administrators or public school teachers at high schools or middle schools.
Yeah, they are barely below journalists on the shit hierarchy.
One of the
They're
things
tied with
that I,
cops.
one
I mean,
of the
look,
things that I noticed,
if I could counter signal just for a moment, I've had some good teachers, all right, and I've never been touched by any of them. So I think we're talking about the extremes. Doesn't excuse it, of course, but let's be a little fair here. I mean, there are good
Sure, but
teachers.
I mean, it's
Yeah,
like,
but,
you know, when the system
you
is set
grow
up
up
to
in
protect those tails, like, I mean, I
yeah,
think
I'm not defending it.
yeah,
I'm just trying to
it's-
say don't cast aspersions to the entire group of people. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and
There are
there's
good
there's a
teachers.
lot of survey data that indicates that people have it's kind of like the congressman paradox. Like everybody hates Congress, but everybody loves their local congressman because he's so nice and he does the fundraisers and whatnot. Like people have really bad opinions about the kind of global education system of the US, but generally they actually like their local school district.
Well, parents who care will go to a school district that they prefer as well.
right?
Well, do you guys want to just kind of debate over this idea of ideological conditioning or instruction on as a matter of principle?
Sure.
Because I would put forward the idea that this is, first of all, it's going to take place regardless. Like people,
Right.
it's the simple lemming principle. The masses are going to conform to something, and it should be the role of the state to ensure that what they conform to is in the interest of the nation. It is in the interests of European civilization.
Like maybe ideally, but okay, let's just jump into it. Like,
Well,
that may be like, I mean, that's like saying, okay, well, your government should be ideally all powerful and good. I mean, that's basically what that boils down to. It's like, okay, well, theoretically, if you construct like a platonically good state, then, you know, why shouldn't it be all powerful since you want good people to have power? But it's such a straw man given the composition of any extant society and just the empirical impossibility of having very extremely large, powerful systems, organizations that are both well managed and long running and have good outcomes. Like that doesn't actually exist. The closest thing you have is, I don't know, maybe a few monasteries would maybe qualify for that, but they're also not of huge scale. Like there's no existing example for recorded human history of having a institution that is over 4 digits in size that has lasted for multiple generations and everybody agrees like, yeah, basically they're doing a good job, they're doing good stuff, let's put these guys in charge, etc. Like that doesn't exist. So when you talk about, well, we should try to inoculate our children with like good values or whatever, I mean, sure, you should try, but you don't actually get to construct a straw man where you have an all-powerful state that successfully achieves that, because that's empirically not possible.
Plato's straw man, but yeah, I would not argue for an excessively top-down system. I would just say that certain forms of education should be prohibited. For example, children should not be taught under if you had a school that was let's say a Christian Zionist private school. In a healthy nation, this would not be allowed.
Well, I mean, fundamentally, when you start talking about how people are going to be allowed to educate their children, you have turned it into a raw contest of power. and one of them is going to be on the floor at the end of it. So unless you're willing to go full to the mattresses and say that, no, the state will control this subpopulation and damn their preferences, then the best alternative by far is to let the ongoing process of social evolution happen. Like, allow parents to control their children's lives and outcomes.
It's absolutely a question of scale, because every day children are born, and those children now have to be educated and raised with whatever moral system that they will get, whether the parents choose it or the state chooses it. And this question of scale is the biggest one, because homogenization is dangerous. Even if you have a perfectly benign and good and true ruler, it would never be possible to push that across the 300 plus million people that we have in this country.
How would you guys feel about an idea like if you had some of the best samples of the population are chosen, and they have to send their firstborn son to the state permanently throughout his entire development to be taught in a state military education system?
I would not want to do that as a parent.
I mean, I would appreciate the option, but I wouldn't want to be forced into it. I mean, that's probably everybody's.
I mean, you're talking
instinct.
Then basically, like, that's essentially very similar to certain Roman and Spartan practice.
Right.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, if you have an aristocracy with political power to the extent that they essentially constitute the state, then I mean, that faction, like, it's not really that much different than the British ruling class sending their children to Eton, however that's pronounced.
Yeah, I believe.
Eton, or whatever
and
that
what they did in
school is in New
Rhodesia
England,
as well with the Milners.
Well, Nick, if I can offer an idea for supporting your idea, not that I'm necessarily in support of it, but I would see this as working if you wanted to implement this. The Chinese system comes to mind in that they've created a system whereby being a member of the Chinese Communist Party is incredibly advantageous to you or your child's career and overall social status, power, wealth opportunities, etc. Therefore, the incentives are there for most parents to want to send their kid into a track where they become basically servitors of this state. And if you wanted to do this without creating a lot of discontent, I would not show up in the middle of the night and steal the baby from the arms of the crying mother. I would probably create a system whereby the mother wants to send
you would
the
want
child.
a culture where the mother would be honored to
That's
submit.
right.
That's
and
what
I was
I'm
gonna
telling
say,
you. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
And more so than an economic benefit, but a higher benefit, whether it's a nation that you're proud of and willing
Ethical
to sacrifice
socialism.
for, which the Han Chinese generally do have, pride in their own nation. Or I'm thinking of Catholic families where a family would be honored to have one of their sons join the clergy. This type of thing, you have to have something real behind it. But if you're telling me that the United States government, as it is today, wants one of my children, absolutely not.
Yeah, lock and load.
Look, let me be clear. Like, as it stands today, I am in full support of people pulling their children out of the Zog education system, 100%.
Hey, they take all your children. As it stands today, a typical mother is expected to go back to work and hand over her kids to daycare or whatever, or preschool or Head Start or whatever it is. And
you don't have
schooling.
The consolation of knowing that your child is going to be educated in a way to make them a superior human being. Instead,
or even a whole human being, even just a basic level human being,
a real human being.
Right.
No, instead you're confident that they're going to come back and say, Mommy, did you know that girls have penises?
Yeah. That was the final straw for me. I knew I wouldn't be able to handle this.
It's gotten
gender
a lot
wars.
worse I have family members who worked in education, not as teachers per se, but I can attest personally that it has gotten far worse.
I mean, it's horrible. It's the entire
15 years.
educational establishment. It's not just public schools. I mean, at places like Stanford University, which is very business oriented, and you would think would have a few Republicans on staff. They have something like 9% of their faculty is like GOP supporters. I mean, it is
Excuse
so
me,
one-sided.
Condoleezza Rice works at Stanford, okay?
Well, she's one of the 9% then. I think she's at the Hoover Institute. Or is she teaching like a class like once a month or something? I don't know.
I think she's faculty at Stanford, I thought.
If you watch any of the sort of public, they put a lot of their lectures online for people to watch, which I'd recommend. It's a good school. But in terms of the ideology, you can see the bias very clearly. When the administrators especially are talking about what their school objectives are, you can see exactly what they're talking about. It's the globalist, elitist crap that everybody has heard ad nauseum at this point. There's no nuance or ideological diversity, if you want to use that term.
Yeah, let's continue to focus on primary school, though. Lynn, what were the beginnings of sort of the reaction to the standardization?
Oh, there were the biggest fights, especially when it was up to Horace Mann, came from the Catholics. They didn't want their kids to be waspified in public schools, and they kept their parochial schools and stuff like that. And then it's the juggernaut of the progressive movement. It just grinds down all resistance until you get to the 70s when
we did skip over. If you're going right to the 70s, we are skipping over something that I am pretty sure I've never heard John Taylor Gatto talk about, which is another glaring omission, which is, of course, the effect of forced racial integration on public schools.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
Ever mentioning this?
I think Gatto's I don't think he would touch that.
No, because every little Negro is a star. Go ahead, Hank.
The source material that I was basing this off of, I read primarily about homeschooling. There's a book, I thought it was fairly even-handed, by Milton Gaither, just called Homeschool. And he sort of investigated the desegregation and busing impact on homeschooling, and concluded that it was basically contemporaneous but unrelated, I guess you could say. When you look at some of the formations of the things like the segregation academies, there was a lot more flight away from public schools and into these alternate institutions, but not so much into homeschooling. That was sort of a later phenomenon, as a lot of the segregation academies imploded for various reasons relating to funding and personality conflicts, and just not really being set up to handle the education of an entire district worth of kids. So,
I mean, speculate about that a little bit, and you can tell me if I'm on the right track, Hank. Do you think it had something to do with people it not really occurring to people at that point, because these are all people who grew up in the education system, that they should reject it altogether, and really what they're looking for is just to find those nice white schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly it. Like the idea of homeschooling seems to only have kind of gained intellectual currency as a named thing in, like, basically, as far as I can tell, the early 70s.
And largely among evangelical Christians who I don't think they really compute the racial question. Even to today, they don't really dip into it.
And
right?
It was factional. The modern homeschooling movement is extremely Christian, predominantly Christian, definitely. But there's still a significant faction, and kind of at the initiation, there was a heavy, I'll just call them hippies, a heavy hippie component.
It's the trad hippie dichotomy, I call it.
Yeah, which often overlapped. So you had this thing. I mean, this is the Whole Earth Catalog, Mother Earth News. We're going to form a, I guess if it's hippies, it's a commune, not a compound. We're going to form a commune or a co-op on a farm, like out in the middle of Vermont, and we're going to grow all of our own vegetables, and
All right.
everybody's going to raise everybody's kids.
Which was an implicitly white movement too.
Oh yeah, super implicitly white.
Yeah.
And that sort of didn't have the same, I guess, intellectual or legal fabric that the Christian homeschooling movement later kind of adopted. But as far as I can tell, it sort of predated it. Like particularly these two individuals, John Holt seems to have been kind of one of the very early. He kind of had an ideological evolution over time. But Lynn, did you have something on him?
Well, I want to caution on John Holt because he was also part of this child rights or youth rights movement, which
gets kind of creepy once you start looking.
This already sounds like a red flag, like libertarians wanting access to your children type.
Yeah. I would red flag John Holt, but absolutely, he was the force behind what eventually now is called unschooling, where you don't even try to do school with your kids, right? So I will go ahead and say that I have a kindergartner, and we homeschool, and I have piles of materials that we use, different math books and phonics books and so on. And so we sit down every day and do schoolwork, where the hippies just said, well, you learn through life, and this is also true. I don't disagree with that at all. But I think that's part of it. Whereas the Christian movement was really more of the systematic and academic, although there's the creationist question as well. But the Christian homeschoolers are really, and still to this day, are just very energetic moms who have incredible crafts and laminating parties, and it's a lot. So it's two different approaches.
Are the unschoolers basically like, here's a Metro card, go forth and learn?
Or here's the co-op. Yeah,
it's a spectrum. Because I mean, when a lot of the people talk about the unschooling, it's like it was meant back in the day, and it's still meant to be kind of a provocative meme.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But I mean, even the unschooling families that I'm familiar with, they do sort of consciously cultivate your ability to, or their children's ability to have exposure to things and to investigate them. Is just sort of like not intentionally structured. But there's like kind of emergent structure, and they're still like, going to museums and reading books and like learning math and things like that.
As a parent, you should practice that in your daily life, right? You should say, count the buttons on your shirt as we get dressed, or we're going to do some cooking project together, and there's measurements and stuff. So there's a lot to learn in everyday life. Absolutely.
But is that what the concept is?
Want to learn about parabolas? We're going to smoke this watermelon.
Because there's two things that I could...
Conic sections.
There's two interpretations of this, and I'm not clear really what it is. You guys can hopefully clarify. But one is that the unschool is about giving your child exposure to lots of real world experiences. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing, though, is that you're not going to guide them. In other words, they're basically, as Nick says, like, here's a bus ticket, go get lost in a bad section of town. You could basically guide them to lots of different things that are outside of the normal sort of desk, classroom-based education, or you could basically do nothing. So I don't know if this is like, free range schooling, no fences allowed.
But even like the free range stuff. I mean, the you're on your own kid is not really a thing that exists in any large numbers. Like some of the hippies on some of the communes, that was there was a really telling quote from one of the women on one of these communes in upstate New York that I wanted a baby, not a kid.
It's much different.
I don't even know what that means.
But yeah, I mean, I think even the extremely hardcore free range, I think even more so the extremely hardcore free range unschooling ones tend to go out of their way to like. In some ways, some of the people who have talked about being raised in these environments that kind of have a bad reaction to it, mostly the kind of hardcore lefties, they resent the fact that a lot of the structure was sort of imposed via passive aggressive, like, well, don't you want to go like learn about whatever the thing, but only if you want to.
Right.
That's not fair to children. That I agree with that. You know, children need structure and routine, and it's not kind to them.
It's a fine line, but yeah, in my experience, having read a lot about these, and like it could be that I'm reading like a different cross section than actually exists, certainly in some places. But it's mostly just unschooling seems to be a brand for a lot of kind of assumptions that certain things fall on one end of a spectrum without really a lot of hard and fast things. That like generally children are inquisitive and like figuring things out and will figure things out if they're encouraged to do so, that you don't need to mandate a particular progression of things, that ideas can be kind of independently arrived on from each other.
Or even that children have a native wisdom that we need to respect, and I think it's just a dangerous mindset. You know, children are wonderful and they do delightful things and come up with stuff, but it's that like noble savage.
I mean, isn't the point of being a parent to basically build your children up and give them the benefit of your experience and try to give them the tools that they're going to need to do well in life? I mean, the fact that you would not give that to them just seems absurd to me.
Yeah, I mean, most of the unschooling people, like, they seem to do things, you know, hey, like, we're going to go do this now. Like, especially the more rural ones. This is like real crack for a particular segment of white people. They're like, we're going to move to a farm in Vermont and learn by doing. And like, we're going to figure out, you know, we got 6 acres to plow and like it takes this long. And now you've learned arithmetic.
I think like, that's good, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, but all this stuff gets very nitpicky and very hippie. Like lots of internecine battles about like what qualifies as this versus that. I don't think a lot of it matters. I think it's like the ideas have enough kind of currency in terms of this kind of quasi Dr. Spock type idea that is weird in its.
He's the childhood development guy, right?
Yeah, the whole like, oh, your baby. It's like, don't worry about it. Just be chill, man.
It's kind of like Stefan Molyneux, but times 10.
Yeah, but I mean, implicitly that reified kind of the wisdom of experts in like advising you that like you can just be chill, man. I mean, a lot of this stuff, there's kind of an underlying anxiety that seems to have popped up as the baby boomers came of age in the 60s and started raising their own kids, that like because there had been all of these social changes, because they had become very divorced from their existing communities and cultures, they were just sort of at a loss about what even to do. Like, here, I have this tiny screaming mammal and he's asking me a lot of questions, like, don't necessarily know how to do any of this stuff.
It's true. It's true throughout childhood and throughout the development of of children. And even Molyneux, one thing he said was that which I disagree with, is that everybody knows how to be a parent because everybody was once a child. So there's like some innate knowledge.
That makes
or
no
the expert.
sense.
No, it doesn't make
What is the duality,
like,
right?
Okay,
Because you have
well, then
hey,
you
everybody's
could
been on
assign
an
other children
airplane,
to-
so they could be a
That's
pilot.
right.
I'm like,
That's
no,
right.
like, wait a minute, go to
No.
pilot school. Like, this is
everybody was once born, so they thus know how to kill.
Yeah.
Like, see, two opposites, and then I connect them with some verbiage and like ponder it for a while. Like, it's so trite. Like,
It's
screw
what it
Molly.
is.
Like,
Well,
come
you know
on.
what, Molly?
Yeah.
This actually is a good transition to another subject I wanted to talk about, which is corporal punishment. I know that Molyneux
Peaceful
is
parenting.
Yes, that's what it's called. Yeah, peaceful parenting, which, as I understand it, goes well beyond like not even just, hey, don't spank your children or feed them soap. It's more extreme than that.
Well,
Do
to
you
give
guys
him
know
credit,
much
I
about
think
this?
he's against circumcision. So to give him a little
Well,
credit.
Well, yeah, circumcision should of course be illegal, but yeah. So peaceful parenting. What's going on there?
I don't know exactly what it is, but just from what you say.
His mom beat the shit out of him. So he's
okay.
against anything, including spanking. That's basically it.
He didn't create this though. It's like this is something, if you go into these circles of unschooling or homeschooling stuff. That's why I'm surprised you haven't heard of it, Len, because it
gets weird fast.
Yeah, it's okay.
Parent. Okay, I'm gonna say this: being a parent is really hard. It's worth doing. It's wonderful in many ways, but you are going to face challenges, and you want to have options. I don't think spanking is a good option. If someone spanks your child, I'm not gonna really worry about it much. Okay, I'm not too worried about the kids that are getting spanked. It's not the same as abuse, in my opinion, but in my opinion, it's also not very useful for modifying the kid's behavior when you're having those troubles. So, but I mean, kids are hard. They will drive you to the to the brink at times. That's what they're supposed to do.
I will say that from the perspective of imposing discipline and order on children in a school environment, I would easily favor corporal punishment over the kinds of psychological humiliation that is currently being used.
That's plausible.
That's probably fair. Yeah.
I mean, it's a very age-dependent thing, and it's very socially dependent too. Like, every piece of data that I've seen indicates that Black people just beat the shit out of their kids with evidently no lasting bad consequences. So, if it
James LaFond
works.
actually has written a lot about that, and he's really anti-spanking because what he sees in Baltimore is a different level too. Like, we're talking about moms using a closed fist against their toddlers in public. I've never seen that.
There's a weird thing too where it's like you've got to it's like the weird matriarchy thing of you've got to man up so that you can like be as violent as you're gonna need to be.
So you can be as violent as your mother.
Right.
Well, as violent as like your baby daddy. Like, and
spanking in that context, or beating, whatever you call it, is just as much a psychological torture as it is a physical one too, because that's what he writes, that it's incredibly emasculating for a young boy to be beaten by his mother in public from such a young age. So I obviously would never be in favor of anything like that. I mean, if you're talking about a swat on the bottom when you're at home in private, that's something.
Or
much
similarly, if it was to be used in a school setting, it should be done not in front of the other kids.
I'm not even comfortable. Yeah, I wouldn't be comfortable giving someone else the authority to spank my child.
Yeah, I can totally understand that, Lynn. But it was something that did exist. And
I went to a primary school that had a paddle in the principal's office. I don't know that it got used when I was there, but it was there. Everybody knew it was there.
Time to dust the paddle.
Yeah.
You can't
that form is
can't be letting the cobwebs accumulate on that. It diminishes the fear.
Humiliating. It's something. You know, I'm more in favor of the rulers with the nuns. For some reason, just rapping your knuckles or something. Something about that. There's just more dignity on both sides, it seems. But getting a kid to lay over your knee and hitting him on the behind, it's just something bizarre
that's perverse.
about that. Exactly.
I agree. There's a very good film. I'm gonna have to show for this movie very quickly. There's a very good Malcolm McDowell film from the Lindsay Anderson, I believe his name, is a leftist filmmaker from the 60s and 70s. It's called If, with an ellipses at the end, and it's a political allegory film. But Malcolm McDowell is sent to a boarding school for boys. And
I thought you were going to mention The White Ribbon.
The White Ribbon. I haven't seen this. I was going to mention another film as well. I'm not going to spoil If. The other film I will spoil because I just watched it. And I can't give it the same level of recommendation as If, but it is very relevant to what we're talking about today. And it was a film called Captain Fantastic with Viggo Mortensen. And basically, he raises his children. He's a widower, and he raises his children in the forests of the Pacific Northwest under sort of an orthodox communist, primitivist lifestyle. He teaches them to hunt with a knife and, martial combat, and a very intense learning regimen where they learn multiple languages, including Esperanto. And then they have to go into the world of the modern capitalist world, and they clash with it. And it brings up the question that always seems to come up when homeschooling is discussed, which is the fear people have of children being under-socialized.
Just such a goddamn straw man. Like,
it is.
Socialized with what? I mean, hanging out with a bunch of people with pants that don't hang on their waistline, and people who can't have no interest in learning or being there. I mean, pick your child's social network wisely, and to put them in a public school these days doesn't seem like the best choice.
And every homeschooled family that I know of goes out of their way to create a positive peer group through church, through access to extracurricular, through other homeschooling families, through non-academic clubs. Like, we have a global telecommunications network now that allows you to find local people in your area of common interests and inclinations without needing any terribly sophisticated kind of a priori social networks, although it does help. So, I mean, compared to, all right, well, we're going to take 16 random people of roughly the same age and we're going to lock them in a room. You're creating a prison gang. A prison gang is highly socialized. They have awesome little rituals, and they have a very complex social hierarchy. They know a lot of stuff about each other. It's not a positive development.
I would like to say something here. I think there are a couple factors involved. One is that the homeschooling movement is now really mature, in my view, because it took off during the 1980s. So if you think about people who were in elementary school in the 80s, are now grown up in their 40s probably and raising their own kids. So they have the benefit. So everybody has the benefit of probably knowing some homeschool kids who are fully grown up and kind of normal. So I think that helps. In my experience, the people who balk when I have talked about it are boomer age people. And I ended up starting to tell people that, I want my kids to be as weird as possible, to just shut it down, because I got really tired. They won't be socialized. But people my age and younger are really open to it because they do understand the level of extracurriculars that are available to everyone, not, even outside of church.
And boomers just grew up in a different America. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
American Graffiti. I mean, how many people had a high school experience like
Fresno.
that?
God, I hate that movie.
Well, so that's one factor, is that the time has passed. But another factor is that, of course, it's the default that everybody must be crammed into these classrooms by age, segregated. and families are smaller, so you have even fewer siblings to interact with of different ages. And this is what I really value about the group that I'm involved in, is that you get all the kids together, not just the kindergartners and not just the second graders. If you're doing a field trip, we all go. So there's one family that has 7 children, and they range from an infant to a 12-year-old. And it's wonderful to let the kids mix together, and the older kids take responsibility for looking after the younger kids. And your kindergartner might make friends with a first grader, or decide she wants to help the preschooler, so it's just normal, because that's what everyone has done, that you should only be friends with other third graders if you're a third grader.
And the fact that like it is age isolated, it vastly I think the inevitable outcome of that is that there's only one sort of point of authority, or kind of social proof, that is the teacher. So it ends up being a much more like the hierarchy is much simpler, and it's much less realistic and much more authoritarian than the sort of emergent social dynamics that happen when you have a very mixed in terms of age and background group.
Yeah, it's very unrealistic. I mean, you're always outside the classroom going to be interacting with people of different ages.
That's right. Yeah. And the other thing is,
women should be teachers. I mean, I'm sure you do a good job, Lynn, but
well, if you're in homeschooling, you're almost always going to be with your mom.
I mean other, especially childless women.
Oh,
yeah.
They're
something to look out for.
Oh boy, looking back, holy shit! Ms. Interesting. Not married, huh? Yeah.
Well, or the teachers who they're always dropping from Mrs. to Ms. and back to Mrs. again, and their names are always changing.
Not stable.
I'm no longer Miss Ratchet anymore.
Well, I don't know. I mean, in certain situations, it's really better for women. If you're talking about small children, there are women who are really
there's
suited
evidence
to that.
for that. I think young children, women are pretty good. When you get older, I think the men. I don't know if there's data on this. I mean, I guess there would be if you're saying women are better at younger ages, but my instincts tell me that at an older age, it's sort of like your first contact is your mother. Then as you get older, your father becomes more important.
Right.
Well, it's because at an older age, I mean, the way that men can impose discipline and order is direct and forceful, whereas women will do it in these roundabout, surreptitious, conniving, subversive, catty, petty, sadistic ways.
I think we all had a teacher like that. My favorite teachers were probably the men, but that's because I liked math and science and stuff. So those were more men oriented subjects. But
very difficult to hire female math and science teachers.
Oh, there was a hilarious Simpsons episode on this where Lisa is dropped into a feminine-led science class or something like that, or math class, and they're like, okay, what's the solution to this problem? And everybody's like, well, what about this? Yeah, if it works for you, it's something. It was like totally non-structured, and I mean, it was portrayed better by the episode, obviously, but the concept of there's no right answer was sort of the kind of hyperbolic, point they were trying to make about this extremely feminized version of education, which I think is a little bit unfair, but nonetheless, it made some valid points, I thought.
Does anyone know when gender segregation ended in public school?
I think that was mostly not segregated to begin with.
Yeah, they didn't have
if
that.
You have a very small
primary
classroom.
School. Yeah, exactly.
Gender segregated.
I've seen photo black and white of like really rural schoolhouses where boys and girls are sitting in the same room. So I don't think it was a private school thing, perhaps, but Catholic in particular, but I don't think it was a general practice.
I mean, that's more of a boarding school thing, which, when you're sort of living together, you would want that to be gender segregated. But as far as I know, I can't think of any public school system that was like gender integrated this side of like the 1940s or something. Do we want to talk a little bit about the sort of religious aspects? Because that's something, we all have kind of varying religious backgrounds and opinions on the show here. And, the fact that the homeschooling movement is so heavily religious and dominated by people with different religious sensitivities or sensibilities, I guess.
Do you know what the numbers on that are? Anecdotally, I agree with you, but I'm curious to know what the breakdowns are, if you know.
I mean, I've read this. According to this source material, it was upwards of 9%, but it's difficult to get a good census.
Do you know what predominant type of religion is it? Christian,
Protestant, Protestant evangelicals mostly.
I know Mormons do it a lot, but
well, Mormons in Utah have really good schools, and they probably still have a lot of Mormonism in the school. I would think more than anyone else could get away with. But I think what part of what was driving it in the Christian homeschooling movement is that you have to recognize that your kid is getting religious instruction, whether it's the religion of the state or it's the religion of the family, right? Because this is just part of raising a child.
Yeah, well put. That's exactly what it is.
So a child who attends public school is really receiving religious instruction, whether you like it or not. It's the materialist religion, economic religion of America. And that's what they rejected. And those families really prove it because they work hard to teach their children in terms of academics.
And pay taxes for other people's kids.
That's right.
Which is absolutely criminal. I mean, the voucher concept, which was big in the 80s, with Milton Friedman, is a pretty fair concept. I guess people.
But teachers' unions are very powerful.
I have zero problem with the idea of people with more wealth paying to ensure that the next generation is properly educated. And
sure, but that's distinct from the idea of vouchers. Like the idea of like public funding for education is distinct for how that gets allocated between different.
Right.
Could you go into that a little bit, Hank?
Oh, so I mean, like you basically, everybody pays taxes, it goes in a big pot, and then like that can be doled out. Either, the public education system receives 100% of whatever school funding or whatever, versus like every child comes with whatever the funding level is.
And what if you don't have kids? What if you don't have kids and the guy down the street's got
well,
9?
you still benefit from having, like, education is a public good.
Done
absolutely.
Right, yes.
Absolutely.
You benefit from having a society where, like, you can go and ask a person to do a thing and they're able to do the thing.
Well, and if you've abdicated your duty to produce the next generation, perhaps you should be paying double in taxes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of parenting. Yeah. If you value citizens as commodities, I guess, public school is just a fraction of what goes into raising a child.
Again, I gotta be clear for the list. Like, I'm not talking about the current system. I'd say, if you can get away with it, pay as little taxes as possible, and don't give your kids to these monsters. But
a lot of the voucher shenanigans. I mean, it's just like everything else in America, where you have an enormous capture program where you have like the Gulen schools that we've magically decided to import the CIA.
You mean CIA Turkey terrorist?
Yeah, the CIA Turkish like plotter in waiting that is like hanging out in the Poconos.
Sailor covers this guy.
Yeah, Sailor has good articles on this.
So does Cbel Edmonds has written a lot about Gulen and the Gulen network.
Yeah, but he operates a successful network of charter schools, mostly with H-2B worker imports from Turkey. You got to keep it all in the family, and then slurping up the voucher and charter dollars in order to fund the whole thing. I mean, there's just like scandal after scandal, which doesn't mean, of course, like the public school system is absolutely much, much worse. But vouchers don't necessarily solve the problem of you have like education is a big business. Like that's one of the U.S.'s primary exports, especially once you include higher education into that. But increasingly on the high school level, like there's a ridiculous number of foreign students that are essentially paying full freight to private primary and secondary schools in California in particular. I know in the East Coast as well, that's a nice scheme to arrange for your kids to be counted as residents if they graduate from a domestic private high school. They no longer have to pass the test of English as a foreign language test, and they're considered in state for tuition purposes. So, I mean, that's sort of a digression, but the point is that like the benefit is that it allows these alternatives to flourish. Not all of those alternatives are good. Some of them are actively pernicious. I find it difficult to believe that they could be any worse than a non-voucher system. So I would be totally in favor of just voucherizing the entire system.
Open market for education, it would be interesting.
Well, let's talk about. Please go ahead, Hank. Did you have something else on this?
Well, I mean, I don't know how much economic autism, but I mean, there's a lot of fixed costs, and it's difficult to scale down some of these enormous bloated schools where you have like classes of 3,000 students, and suddenly they're not very good, and they're able to actually flee, and then the institution enters a death spiral. So like in a lot of circumstances, it's very difficult to manage that transition from an extremely centralized system. You know, essentially like how do you manage a Soviet style collapse where suddenly your one giant tank factory isn't making anything because the product sucks? And how do you retransition?
The Soviets had a actually pretty good education system. When I was in Russia, I was told by many that prior to the collapse of the USSR, the education system was superior.
They were very good. Programs. Yeah, hard sciences, STEM fields basically were prioritized. Basically, it was a state policy to have an educated population in those fields.
And they probably weren't shy about tracking kids either.
Oh no, that was the entire point.
Right.
Like if you have a system that to varying degrees, but if you have a school system that's devoted towards like ruthlessly extracting the top 10% and sending them as far as they can go, and slice it, you know, as fine as you want, top 10, top 5, top 1. You can do that, and that actually works very well because there's dual sortition with the students and the resources ending up getting matched very effectively. But what the US tries to do is exactly the opposite, where a vast amount of resources, particularly in things like special ed, foreign students, there's essentially a federal mandate where if your child qualifies as special education, the resources available to them are effectively unlimited.
This has to do, I think, with autism too.
Yeah, can you declare your homeschooled child a retard and get a bunch of money from the system?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes is the short answer.
Yeah.
They don't even have to be homeschooled either. It works better if your goal is maximum. Probably want to be. So the trick is, from what I understand, you depends on how far down the road you want to go, because a lot of this is like run via the same like social worker welfare schemes where your 8-year-old ends up collecting SSI because they're profoundly emotionally disturbed or whatever. But my understanding is that the special ed racket is them, then like they need extra resources and the school can't provide them, so they end up paying a third party, and you end up getting some sort of weird kickback via that scheme.
Something to think about.
Disability Nation.
That's right. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Lynn. I've talked for long enough.
Oh, I was just gonna say that there's I think there were some big lawsuits on the part of parents of autistic children who wanted more resources for their kids, and eventually they won. And now, once you get into the system, there are a ton of resources, and it's not even for school age children. You can start this at any stage. I know different kids who are born with different delays or have different delays growing up for reasons that don't matter, but it doesn't matter the socioeconomic background. If your baby is premature or something like this, you will automatically be part of the system, and the therapists will come to your house, and speech therapist, language therapist.
I do not understand this. This is just my personality. I don't blame people for wanting to get what they're due because they pay taxes. That's fine. But the notion that my family's misfortune is everybody's problem is totally alien to me. And frankly, it disgusts me that people hold up. I
absolutely could not disagree more. It's just completely antithetical to the entire principle.
Well, I'm not a
of
socialist,
community and
and
civilization.
I don't believe in putting my problems onto your plate. That's not fair to you. And if you want to put your problems onto my plate, well, we can discuss that, but it's not something you can force on me, in my opinion. And I'll fight you if you do.
And most of these educational interventions.
Okay, I'll give you my problems next week. How about that? You solve them for me.
Like the problem with a lot of these interventions is that they're very expensive, but there's absolutely zero evidence that they do anything.
Yeah, that is pretty clear. I mean, it's the autistic children should be put into like a Herman Hesse glass speed game type monastery where their IQ superpowers are cultivated and they can solve complex problems.
I think families need help. There are certain families that absolutely do need help, and I mean, some level of socialism is here with us. I don't think it's ever going to go away. So I know some people who are one person who is profoundly disabled due to childhood illness. He had very bad brain damage, and so he still goes to, we call it school, but it's some kind of adult program. And it has to be in your community. It has to be. This is where it breaks down, where you don't have you just have this economic zone of United States of America that it makes it hard to want to help people who have misfortune. But I agree that most of the therapies they do are quite useless. Like one kid I knew who didn't walk until she was maybe 2.5, and she was going to learn, if that's her fate, that she would walk at 2.5. That's her fate. All the hours of therapy they put into it, I don't believe made any difference. So
communities should have the ability for individuals in those communities who are interested in caring for the retarded and the infirm and the elderly and those who do not have anyone else. They should be able to get subsidies from the state to do so. And yes,
sure,
you out of the taxpayer.
Like a lot of it is like, okay, this child is so profoundly disabled that they're like nothing that you do will ever like.
No, I just mean taking care of them, not educating them. I just mean making sure.
But that's the problem, because the mandate is that they be educated.
Oh yeah, well that's
right.
From the egalitarian.
It's an open mandate, and effectively it's like, well, if I can get somebody to testify that this particular cat lady will make like potato over here more educated, despite the fact that he's nonverbal for the last 12 years, like that's
that you should throw that out.
It's really easy to burn a lot of money on these things.
Because all those people have to be college educated, and they have to be in a facility that meets all these standards, and And so it's a huge industry. In California, it's very big, especially because you can get paid as the mom or aunt or anybody can get paid to look after these people. Also, the people who need if the medical board or whatever says that you need care, then the state is going to pay someone to hang out at home with you. And it's oftentimes a parent of that person. So,
well,
or
Nick,
another family member.
Do you support the Affordable Care Act?
Oh, you want to debate
like Obamacare?
No, it's a concept. It's a concept of forcing people to pay taxes if they don't need health care for other people that do need it. It's the same concept that we're discussing now.
I would support one that wasn't a racket for the pharmaceutical companies, and et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
Yeah, of course.
Well, given the track record we have with our bureaucracies, I mean, it's an easy thing to say, well, I don't support the current system, but I would like it to be better. I mean, sure, I guess I would too, but it always comes to the question of how are you going to do this? And the track record just does not seem to be in its favor in my view. And I think we can agree. Let's just be positive here for a second that we want to have a constructive society, whatever that means, right? But I'm not against having resources pooled if that pooling of that resources can improve the overall health and well-being and value, whatever you want to call it, of the community. But we have to be very, very critical on measuring that, because if it's not working, we have to kill that program. We have to change it. And
the United States is a racket. Everything about
yeah.
it.
And every program here gets entrenched and never goes away.
Yeah.
The U.S. is still under the impression that it's a wealthy country that can just sort of afford infinite slack.
Well, that's because it has a currency that nobody is willing to substitute for yet, but that's the only thing holding it up. I mean, we're printing money. We're going into further and further amounts of debt.
Okay, I'd like to bring it back to education, because this topic of which therapies make any difference in your life and which ones don't makes me want to talk about phonics. So this is for parents who are listening or people who will become parents. Please understand that your children need to be taught phonics. They should not be taught whole word or sight words or whole language reading. They need to know that each letter and each combination of letters makes a particular sound, and that they should sound out the words. Okay, and I will give you a list of resources to give to people. I mean, just because I have to say that as a parent, because I know children who struggle, and some children will certainly learn how to read regardless of whatever their teachers are doing, because that's, the exceptionally bright children will. But these are the things that our educational institutions feel they have to reinvent from time to time. And that one's particularly harmful.
Do you use Hooked on Phonics, Lynn? Is that still
We
around?
don't use Hooked on Phonics. I don't know if it probably is still around. What I'm doing with my girls is just a book called Learn to Read in 100 Easy Lessons.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty simple and just step by step, and you can start it with pretty young kids as long as they seem like they're ready.
Well, let's talk a little bit about one of my main, unless you have more to say about phonics, Lynn.
No, I felt the need that I didn't want this thing to be over.
Oh, no, sure, please. No, it's great.
Yeah,
that's please, if anything else comes to mind as far as advice you want as we go on, and as we also begin to wrap it up.
I had a couple of questions, but please proceed.
Yeah. So I want to talk about exposure to the culture poison. And I get the impression that it's really these days not so much, with the young children, it's definitely them coming home after being, scared shitless about the whales or about the Holocaust currently being perpetrated against homosexuals, et cetera, et cetera. But I get the feeling that you get to around the high school or middle school age, it isn't really the inculcation of correct thinking and the zeitgeist, civic religion, et cetera, is not really done so much by the actual teachers and the institutions. At this point, these children all have cell phones, and they all consume the a Jewish Hollywood poison, and various internet, whatever it is that 8th graders do on the internet. This is where they're exposed to the culture ideas. And I think it comes back again in the college years when they put on their, oh, I'm a important person now hat and start to imbibe seriously what their lesbian professors are telling them. So from a homeschooling perspective, how is it that you inoculate them to the culture poison? Because that to me is the biggest concern. I think a child could make it through the system schools just fine, barring that element. That's the thing that would really scare me, exposure to.
I have an idea.
Please.
I don't know if this is it, but I think that if you look in the HBD, people like, I'm thinking of J-Man. I don't know if you guys know who that is, but
of course, yeah.
Yeah. So he loves to say how parenting doesn't matter. But what turns out, I think, that does matter is the peer group. And so when you're homeschooling, you're controlling that peer group to a greater extent, but it's still a big risk. And especially when they go away, or even if a lot of homeschoolers switch to a public or a private school in high school, or obviously college. And that's when those peer group effects take place. So my strategy for that is to control the peer group and to limit the culture poison, as you put it. We have videos that we watch. So it's not zero at our house, but it's not like open TV or anything like that.
It seems also that one way that this could be achieved is not just the negative side of keeping them away from the poison, but also trying to engender an appreciation for high culture and real art.
I agree
Absolutely.
with that. Yeah, and I also think engaging your children, this is easier said than done, obviously.
You just got to not do it like the what they call the tiger moms, the fanatical Chinese women who will make their children play Chopin for 8 hours a day, and then
you pray violin now.
Yeah.
We are surrounded by tiger people here, and that was another reason, because it's this bimodal situation where either you have a school that's just kind of underwater in terms of the peer group, that nobody else is going to keep up with these kids, or here in Silicon Valley where you have like 3rd generation tech spawn, kids who are just really selected for math and science aptitude, and parents who have those cultures of extreme education. So we wanted to go down the middle route for that.
When you have these tiger mothers, what they end up doing is, you're already swimming upstream trying to engender appreciation for culture in a Chinese person due to their absence of having a soul. But in general, like the fear is that if you force these things on children and it's not organic, that they'll have a negative reaction to it in the future. If you force them, and it's a chore for them to learn to play the piano or what have you.
All right. It's hard because you do have to force your kids to do stuff like brush your teeth and
right, of course.
So you think of something like piano. We have started very light piano lessons, and she's not crazy about it, but I'm going to keep pushing for now. We're just going to take it.
I think the way to balance the two extremes of, doing nothing versus, forcing everything is, and I have this is years ago, but I remember having dinner with a Chinese friend of mine. A few of them have souls, I believe. But I could be wrong. He was a bright kid. He went to MIT, and he however was aware of sort of these sort of tiger tendencies in the Asian culture, obviously, and being in America for most of his life, he knew this. And he said that, when he went to school, he was with, Asians and whites, not too many blacks, weirdly, but there was a clear difference between the talent level of the Asians versus the whites, because there were probably, I don't remember what he said exactly on this, but I'm assuming that there were fewer whites there at this point than Asians. But what he said, though, was that the whites that were there were actually talented. Like they were good at it. And I think that's how I would approach it. If I were, a parent of somebody who's maybe going to, go into something like this, is that if, pianos, for example, you have to expose your kids to things that they may not like initially, in my opinion. If it's, in your view, going to be good for them. But if they're really fighting it, they're not good at it, especially, you're really wasting their time. I think they have to have some ability and potential there for them to actually shine. And that's what you want to, develop in your kid. You want to have a good, strong kid. And if they're not good at it, there should be something else they should be doing.
My inclination would be towards getting them to have an appreciation that doesn't require a lot of work to begin with, and then moving on to getting them, because once they appreciate it, if you can get them to appreciate real music or real literature, real stories, then you say, now you're going to try to do this, and I'm going to put you in front. Now you're going to have to work at it. But I think that you would turn off a child if they have zero appreciation. They don't like music at all, and then you want to make them play a piano or something.
I think you're right, Nick, and I think that this is why you can't really fake it. If you have to share with your children what you love, and for reasons of biology, DNA, and culture, they will end up perhaps loving this similar things that you do. So if you're listening to, I don't know what people listen to, but if you're just not a
Myth
naturally
of the 20th century.
Well, I mean music, like popular music, and then you send the kid over to listen to this music that they're not familiar with or whatever, then that would be harder. We have played classical music from early times, and the kids recognize it and they like it, and it's something that takes practice even just to listen to. So I think there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot to that.
My goal would be when they became older that if they went over to a friend's house who goes to Zog school and the friend is playing, Bobo jungle rhythms, I want them to be disgusted, and I want them to look down on this fucking pleb. I mean, you can
okay, you can accomplish this. You can achieve this, Nick, and I'll give you my anecdotal story, which is that we played exclusively classical music, and when my older kid was screaming in the car, I would turn it to some other station, and she would get really angry. It was like punishment, basically, because she didn't want to hear the jungle music.
That's adorable. That's great. That's great to hear. I was, as a child, I was read The Hobbit at a very young age, and that was one of my fondest memories.
Yes,
the whole thing. Wow.
Yes. In fact, I went on after that, as I was saying, like once you appreciate it, I did a child's play of The Hobbit, and I absolutely would never have agreed to do that had I not already enjoyed The Hobbit. I never would have wanted to, you want to do this play? No, of course not.
And
but
we
it was
go,
The Hobbit, so I did.
Yeah.
We go to the library. By the way.
Oh, that's a good role. We get CDs from the library, and I store those files locally so that I play The Hobbit for them, and we have lots of other books on tape which they listen to, some Roald Dahl books and other ones too. But they like The Hobbit.
Hey, what do you think about sports?
Yeah, good thing to mention.
Yeah, it's important as well. It's still a little early for us, but we play outside as much as we can. And I already know I'm not going to be a person who like drives around the state to attend tournaments or whatever. So
they call those soccer moms, Lynn.
Soccer moms.
Yes, you have to have a minivan though to go along with it.
I also don't favor sport. I have two girls, and I don't favor sports for girls or even boys. You have to be careful with concussions, and for girls, their knees, that they soccer just wrecks their knees. You know, lots of girls who had ACLs or whatever done.
Oh, I knew a girl in high school that her leg was actually crooked because of you have to like kick sideways basically all the time, like you're passing the ball. And
right.
So her leg like curved because of that.
Yeah.
I had a girl
not
from
into that.
high school who was a very high level soccer player, and that is exactly what had happened to her. ACL. It actually got worse and worse than that.
Yeah, so we will be vigilant for that, but something we'll find the right thing. It's still early for us.
What about organizations like Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts? The Girl Scout seems like a kind of a cookie racket for the Jews, but
I can speak to the Boy Scout experience, and
yeah,
and
you can, Adam. That's right. Were you an Eagle Scout?
Yeah, and not to dox myself too much. There's a lot of those, but
there's a lot of them, especially in the Philippines.
Yeah,
the biggest.
Surprisingly, there's a lot of people who got to life, and they never want the extra mile to get Eagle. So sometimes you got to force your kids, in my opinion. But nonetheless,
but it's gotten a bad reputation as of lately.
No, I agree with you.
The big homosexual infiltration.
It's pathetic. When I was there,
and women.
Well, and I'm going to tie this back to homes. Yeah, they're suing each other now apparently for the name usage or some absurd shit. I think they were going to call it. I don't know. The Girl Scouts are suing the Boy Scouts.
Oh wow,
petty nonsense.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't look into it. I've given up on that organization. But when I was there, the big thing was can Scoutmasters be gay? And it was like they're around little boys. Like, why is this even a debate? And first of all, why is it up to some external organization what the Boy Scouts do? Why can't they just say fuck off? But and
we really need to create our own version of that, our own
completely agree
youth society.
Completely agree.
Well, there exist Boy Scout alternatives now, specifically because of
they're typically Christian, but yeah, they
issues.
Exist. Yeah.
I mean, the Boy Scouts were pretty implicitly Christian.
No, big time. Oh yeah, you have to state a belief in God, which for me was awkward, but whatever. And I don't necessarily disbelieve, but I like to believe things I see, and so that was sort of my I had to get over that. But no, it's very true. They are religious. You have to believe in something. Faithful is one of the sort of tenets of their principles. But overall, I enjoyed the experience. Let me just be clear. I think it taught me a lot of good skills, social skills as well. And it is used by a lot of parents to sort of tie it into the homeschooling thing as a sort of social outlet for homeschooled children. I actually was in another organization after Scouts that is related to it, and there were boys and girls, and there was a girl in there who ended up going to a really good university. So her intelligence wasn't in question, but she was the most awkward person. I honestly, one of the most awkward people I've ever met in my life, and she was homeschooled. And so they'd sent her to this. And actually she came from a family that was, it was like the Brady Bunch, she was from the mother, and then like her brother was like a half brother from the father's family, and he had gone to public schools, and he was also in that program. He was not nearly as weird. Like, he was actually pretty cool, in my opinion, but I'd gone to public schools, and so I was used to that. So I don't want to necessarily say that, he was cool, I'm cool, she's weird, maybe we're weird and she's cool, but at the same time, like, she did some pretty weird shit. So I don't know. There's something to the, like, not being exposed to certain sections of society that I think does make you a little bit underdeveloped. If you're basically in your house all day, getting given like Kaplan test prep so you can get in, to a good university with good SAT scores, I think you're going to turn out a little bit different than other people, which isn't necessarily bad, but you do need to have some way to bridge those differences other than just the interaction with your parents. So that was my experience.
Well, I would say that possibly she would have been just as weird in public school, and maybe she would have been picked on as well.
Yeah, that's possible,
that
but the only
worse.
reason I say it's maybe partly because of the homeschooling is because her brother, well, maybe it's because they're half brothers and half sisters.
Yeah.
But they did have a shared home life for at least a period, and I don't know when they connected, but
yeah,
there was a certain German movement in the 1930s that organized the German youth into categories from ages 14 to 18, 10 to 14,
right?
Boys and girls. You had
Oh, the Germans outlawed the Boy Scouts too. They thought it was.
Well, it's a tool of Freemasonry.
Right,
Well,
unironically, it is. But
American-sponsored paramilitary organization.
Well, it was British in founding, to be technical, but yes, it caught on.
It unironically is a tool of Freemasonry.
Baden-Powell. He was fresh out of the concentration camps of the Boers in South Africa, and he said, "You know what? We need to teach young boys how to do this."
Literally everything coming out of the United States is some kind of tool of Freemasonry.
Yeah, pretty much.
It's actually shocking. I don't really buy into the shit, but it is shocking if you look into it. Like, oh, this guy's a Freemason, that guy's a Freemason. Like, wow. I think Hank posted about this a while ago that it's almost as if the Freemasons got cucked by Americans and that it became like this uniquely Anglo-American thing. Whereas it was originally intended to be this sort of global conspiracy unit to help liberate man or whatever. And then it just becomes like a good old boys network for every state house in the United States.
I'd say the Masonic ideology is still fundamental to global homo neoliberalism.
I don't know. I don't really think so anymore. I think if anything, since doing stuff that is kind of contradictory to that. There's a lot of Masons that are cops. There's a lot of Masons that are part of like the Patriot movement. I'm not really into the whole liberation of man thing anymore. It is just the United States is like it's just a good old boys network.
Yeah, that's obviously true. Your local lodge or.
Have you been to a Masonic lodge in like the last 10 years? It's just old boomers who really like who really love the American flag.
Of course, dude. I'm not saying that there's like a vast the Masons are a vast network of, in every small town in America there's this some epicenter of subversion for their local area. They are as you described, but the current ruling ideology of the Western liberal empire still has deep Freemasonic roots.
It has roots, but what the Masons have become is like, I don't know, like the whole Bonesman phenomena over CIA. It's just just Anglos hanging out.
The general decline of WASP power is symptomatic of it.
I just had one more question. I know your kids are still too young for this to be thinking about it too much. I'm sure you have put some thought to it, but what do you think the proper role for quote unquote higher education is in a kid's life? Is that something a parent could even assist with, or is that something that needs to be done by an external organization, Lynn?
Well, I think we have to work in the system that as it exists today, and it goes by so fast when you're raising kids that I have to consider it as the universities that are prestigious today are going to remain prestigious, and the economy that we're in does kind of demand it. I think men have more options, in terms of building a career outside of a university. And for a woman, I fully support staying at home and having as many babies as you can and stuff, but realistically, I'm grateful for the fact that I could go out and earn a living if I had to. Okay, so there's
right.
I feel that
it's not up to you, which is unfortunate. It's like you have to do that. Like you're in a system where your husband, on average, not you in particular, but like the average man does not have enough money to support a family like at least he used to in the 1950s when all the women stayed at home. Obviously, it's possible. So something changed. A lot of things changed, but. I wanted to run this by you because I listened to the Z-Man podcast, and he's a pretty prolific blogger. I brought him up several times. He was talking about he gets listener questions, in the latest show he was talking about what he thought about what they were asking about. And one of the questions was, what should you do? Like I have a kid who's going to college. Like what should he major in? Like what's the right thing to do? And he basically said for college, the strategy he would recommend for parents with their children is that if you have a boy, make sure, two things. One, if he's bright enough or you're connected enough, that's probably actually more apropos. If you're connected enough to get into one of these Ivy Leagues, like you're saying, like it's still part of the economy and system we live in, send them there if they can. It's a hard thing to do, but that'll set them up for life. If they're not able to do that, if they're bright enough to pursue a STEM field, definitely do that. But view college overall as basically a accreditation, not an accreditation system, but a vocational school, like something that's going to teach them a skill that's going to get them employed. If you have a girl, send them to college where they're going to meet a good husband. That's what he said. I'm wondering if you think that's offensive. I mean, because a lot of women would, and I really would like to hear what you have to say about that.
No, you have to be realistic. I mean, a good husband is the most important thing you could want for your daughter, honestly. Not a career. A career is easy to get compared to getting a good husband.
Yeah.
So what I would support my daughters is to stay home and go to the junior college and do as much as you can there. If you want a way to make a living that's flexible and decent, could be teaching, could be healthcare, accounting, something that can be done at mid-level without having to like strive into management. I was in public accounting, that Big Four, where you have to like push, otherwise they don't want you. So that's not a good choice, but corporate accounting is better. So there are ways to make a living, and absolutely the thing is that you educate yourself around here in our home, and for you guys too. What all these things that you have talked about and hundreds of podcasts, none of those things were things that you learned in school.
Definitely
not. We already know, right? We already know that on this side of the web or whatever, that you educate yourself, and school is formal schooling is an economic tool. And if my girls get accepted to incredible schools, it's probably going to be hard to say no. But my preference would be go to the JC, live at home. And
well, the other thing that he said about the girls is that if you send them to a big sports school, most of the big stories about these rape allegations come from those types of schools. So cross those off your list, if nothing else.
Cross those off.
Sports schools means big binge drinking schools. They're pretty, I mean, like party schools.
It means a lot of ooga booga.
Right.
Well, not necessarily. Like the demographics are different, and some of them are like also academically rigorous or have academically rigorous some components, but that ends up being a large part of the culture in a lot of state schools.
I think any college, I think the smaller liberal arts schools are extremely guilty of this, where they go out and they're like the most PC, because they kind of want to prove their tuitions aren't even much lower than the big name schools, but they want to prove that they're on the cutting edge of this culture and the sports. And I mean, we're in California, so we have UCs as an option, but I've been to a couple different college campuses back in my day, and I was shocked at the drinking and debauchery, and this was 20 years ago or more. So, or no, not more, but so anyway, I think any college is a risk, and you have to view it as not like this is the years of my life, I have to live it up, but that you're there to get a product, which is a degree.
Have you thought about, Lynn, have you ever considered, this is something that just occurred to me, have you ever considered teaching your children how to drink? Obviously when they're older, because part of the reason people die of alcohol poisoning, or they just don't, these kids don't know how to drink. And so you kind of have to accept, well, people,
they say this in Europe a lot, that they're given a glass of wine, at an early age, and they're sort of
just taught drinking with the boys, teach them how to drink whiskey, etc. Because when you don't know how to drink, you can really hurt yourself and do stupid things.
I haven't given it much thought, but I think you're right. And I think there's some studies showing that the drinking habits have changed, that people are more prone to binge drinking now for whatever reason. I don't know, but it is dangerous. And I don't know how you do this, because you have to keep in mind that teenagers are kind of dumb in a special way, that it's not like little kids are different. and they kind of will listen to you to some extent. But
I think teenagers have the notion that they're adults, but little kids
right.
are obviously like, all right,
I need help with this.
I'm half your, I'm like a quarter your size. Like, so
yeah.
Show me.
But there are things, I think we can all probably think of things that our parents didn't do that we would like to do for our children, or the other way around. But yes, you have, and it's a danger for homeschooling families too, because we can protect our kids more. And I think that's another thing that people say is, oh, you can't protect them forever. And that's absolutely true. So we have to introduce these things and have a strategy for them, for our kids.